In CIST 2611, Chapter 13, we'll look at firewall security management. So in this chapter, we're going to identify firewall and network security management best practices. Some of the key concepts covered in this chapter include firewall management best practices. So we'll talk about how implementing effective firewall management practices. This helps ensure the security and integrity of your network. This includes regular firewall rules reviews, access control list optimization, and monitoring for unauthorized changes. We'll also look at firewall threat and exploit mitigation. So we'll look at this and discuss how it is essential for proactive mitigation. We'll look at techniques such as intrusion prevention systems, threat intelligence feeds, and regular security updates and how they help mitigate risk. We'll also look at tools for managing and monitoring a firewall. So this will be used to streamline configuration, monitoring, and reporting tasks. Now, these tools will offer features such as centralized policy management, real-time traffic analysis, and alerting capabilities. We'll also look at firewall testing and troubleshooting and how these rules ensure that they are effective and compliant with security policies. We'll look at how to develop comprehensive testing procedures and conduct periodic audits to identify and address any vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. So first, we'll look at some of the best practices for firewall management. First is to have a written firewall policy. So you want to develop a comprehensive firewall policy. It's going to outline the organization's security objectives, the acceptable use policies, and also the firewall configuration guidelines. Now, these policies should define the rules for traffic, filtering, access control, and acceptable network behavior. You also want to have a plan. So you want to establish a clear plan for firewall implementation, configuration, and management. You'll define the roles and responsibilities for firewall administration, maintenance, and monitoring to ensure accountability and efficiency. You also want to gain a thorough understanding of the organization's network infrastructure, including the network topology, traffic patterns, and critical assets. So you tailor your firewall configurations to align to your organization's specific security requirements and operational needs. Another best practice is to perform a risk assessment. So you want to conduct regular risk assessments to identify potential security threats, vulnerabilities, and compliance gaps that's within your network. So you use these findings from the risk assessment to prioritize firewall rule configurations and security measures. Another best practice is to review the policy regularly. So you want to review and update the firewall policy regularly to adopt to changes in your organization's IT environment, to adopt to any emerging threats or any regulatory requirements that may have come up. You also want to make sure that your firewall policy remains aligned to that organization's overall security strategy and business objectives. Some other best practices is establish a no exception policy. So you implement a strict policy that prohibits exceptions to the firewall rules without proper authorization. And you want to make sure you do this to ensure that all network traffic must adhere to the established firewall policies and access control rules. You also want to focus on establishing a philosophy of a default deny rather than default allow. So this approach minimizes the attack surface and reduces the risk of unauthorized access to the network resources. You also want to ensure that physical security measures are in place to protect your firewall devices from unauthorized access or tampering. So you place those firewalls in a secure locations and implement the access controls to restrict physical access to authorized personnel only. You also want to limit and filter internet connectivity. So you want to restrict outbound and inbound internet connectivity to essential services and protocols. You want to implement filtering policies to block access to malicious websites, maybe known threats, or suspicious IP addresses. Another best practice is to use defense in depth. So you want to implement multiple layers of defense. Now, this is including network segmentation, intrusion detection systems, and endpoint protections. So you combine firewall technologies with other security measures, and this allows you to create a multi-layer defense strategy against cyber threats. You also want to configure firewalls to allow Internet Protocol security, VPNs, and other encryptions. So you'll make sure that your firewall rules permit secure communication channels for encrypted traffic while blocking unauthorized access. You also want to keep it simple security, the CIST rule. So you want to keep it simple when configuring the firewall rules and policies. Your simple firewall configurations, when you simplify those, this reduces the complexity and minimizes the likelihood of misconfigurations or vulnerabilities. You also want to prioritize the firewall rules based on the organization's security requirements and risk assessments. So you'll focus on blocking high-risk threats and known attack vectors while allowing essential services and legitimate traffic. You also want to harden both internal firewall hosts and border firewalls. So you want to secure the firewall devices with regular updates, strong authentication, access controls, and intrusion detection mechanisms. You want to test new code. So before deploying new firewall configurations or updates, you want to thoroughly test them in a controlled environment to identify and mitigate any potential issues. Now, when you conduct testing, this is done to ensure that the new code does not introduce vulnerabilities or disrupt the network operations. One of the best practices to follow is to make a backup. So prior to making any changes to your firewall configurations, create a backup of the current settings. This allows for easy restoration in case of configuration errors, device failures, or any security incidents. After implementing firewall changes or updates, you want to closely monitor network traffic and firewall logs for any anomalies or unexpected behaviors. So you lock down the firewall rules and configurations to prevent unauthorized modifications. And then you monitor that for any changes. You want to develop and maintain a comprehensive incident response plan specific to firewall related incidents. So this plan should outline procedures for detecting, responding to, and mitigating firewall breaches or security incidents. You also want to focus on balancing security and usability. So you want to find that balance between the security requirements and the ease of the usability when configuring a firewall rules. This ensures that firewall policies effectively protect against threats while still allowing legitimate traffic to flow across your network. You also want to develop a firewall checklist. In here, you will define your firewall objectives, establish your firewall rules, review those rule sets regularly. You also want to test all uses of the firewalls. So you conduct a thorough testing of all firewall rules and configurations to ensure that it is sufficient in protecting against unauthorized access and potential security breaches. You want to conduct periodic vulnerability assessments on the firewall infrastructures to identify potential weaknesses, misconfigurations, or vulnerabilities. Finally, one of the last best practice for firewall management rule we'll talk about is perform penetration testing. So you will conduct scheduled penetration testing exercises to evaluate the resilience of your firewall defenses against simulated cyber attacks and intrusion attempts. Now, while doing this, you identify and you can then fix any vulnerabilities or weaknesses discovered during the penetration testing to strengthen your firewall's defenses. So firewall logic and controlling mechanisms are implemented in software, whether it's in the host firewall or an appliance firewall, which is host is software based while appliance is hardware based. Now, these are prone to flaws and errors in the programming. The hackers, they will utilize scanning, testing, and probing tools to identify the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in firewall configurations. Those exploits targeting firewall vulnerabilities can have serious consequences, including freezing or crashing the firewall or granting unauthorized access to adjust filtering rules. Now, exploits targeting firewall vulnerabilities can cause the firewalls to freeze or crash. This can also result in disruption of network traffic and services. The hackers may exploit vulnerabilities, gain unauthorized access to the firewalls, allowing them to read or adjust filtering rules or even bypass those security controls as all. So some mitigation strategies for this is implement regular updates. So you want to keep your firewall software and firmware up to date with the latest security patches and updates to address any known vulnerabilities. You want to conduct vulnerability assessments regularly. So regularly scan that firewall configuration for vulnerabilities and weaknesses and fix any identified issues promptly. Also, you want to restrict access to firewall management interface and administrative privileges to authorized personnel only. Finally, you want to continuously monitor your firewall logs for suspicious activities and unauthorized access attempts, and then respond promptly to potential security incidents. Now, firewall vendors regularly release updates and patches to address security vulnerabilities, bugs, and performance issues. Now, when you get those, you want to promptly apply those vendor updates and patches to ensure the firewall remains protected against known threats and exploits. You want to avoid the first generation or first releases of firewall products. So you exercise caution if you do use these. So you want to wait for initial feedback, reviews, and updates before deploying new firewall products to a production environment. Now, some best practices after installing a firewall. This includes installing all vendor patches and updates. So you always install all patches and updates provided by the firewall vendor. Once again, to address known vulnerabilities and improve your security. But you want to test updates before you deploy them. So before you deploy those updates in the production environment, you want to thoroughly test them in a controlled environment to ensure the compatibility and scalability and stability. You want to avoid deploying alpha, beta, pre-release, release candidates, and test build patches on production firewalls. So you only deploy full and final releases of the firewall patches that are provided by the vendor. Now, firewall filter and traffic management is vulnerable in some way. They may always have these vulnerabilities or weaknesses that can be exploited by attackers. So you want to make sure that you implement additional security measures such as intrusion detection or prevention systems. This has helped to build that defense in depth to augment your firewall's defenses and detect potential threats. Now, firewalking is a firewall testing and probing technique used to discover some or all the rules on a static packet filtering firewall. The attackers utilizing firewalking to determine which ports are open and closed on a targeted network, potentially revealing security weaknesses in firewall configurations. Now, the overlapping, these are fragmentation attacks. This is things like overlapping, overrun. What they do is they exploit weaknesses in the firewall handling of fragmented packets. So overlapping involves the creation of new datagrams by combining parts of previous datagrams, while overrun generates excessively large datagrams. Now, these attacks can lead to a denial of service or attempts to confuse IDSs and firewall filtering mechanisms. Now, fragmentation is a supported function of IP packets. It allows large packets to be broken into smaller fragments and transmission across network segments with different various maximum transmission unit sizes. Now, packet fragments, when they encounter network segments with a smaller MTU, they're reassembled at the destination. Overlapping attacks exploit weaknesses in the fragmentation process that absorb the fragmentation offset value in the IP header, causing it to reassembly overlap. Internal code planting is one of the most common methods used to exploit or bypass a firewall security mechanisms. So in this, the attackers may attempt to plant malicious code or backdoors within the firewall's internal systems or configurations to evade detection and gain unauthorized access. A firewall's vulnerability to DOS flooding, they are susceptible to denial of service flooding attacks when the attackers overwhelm the firewall with a high volume of traffic and it causes it to become unresponsive or crash. DOS flooding attacks can disrupt network operations and compromise the availability of firewall services. Now, it is essential to recognize that firewalls have limitations and weaknesses that cannot always be addressed through upgrades and patches. So, as we talked about, adding that defense in depth, organizations must implement additional security measures such as the IDS that we've talked about, load balancers, and network segmentations to mitigate the risk associated with firewall vulnerabilities. Hacker tunneling involves bypassing firewall restrictions to establish unauthorized connections between internal and external systems. So, one method of this is the attacker installs a server component on an internal system that allows the external client's component to initiate the connection. Now, this method requires the firewall to allow inbound initiation connections to internal systems, and that's potentially exposing them to external threats. Method number two, a second method, is dealing with outbound connections. That's where the attackers install a server component on an external system, and then here they are leveraging an internal client's component to initiate the connection. Now, with this approach, it requires that the firewalls allow outbound connections from internal systems to external servers, which is also posing security risk. Now, tunneling set up using inbound connections. Attackers must hijack an existing opening port or reconfigure the firewall to open another port for the tunnel's use. Now, proper use of the deny by default stance should limit both inbound and outbound connections to those explicitly allowed. So if the firewall permits outbound connections, internally initiated tunnels become relatively easy to establish, potentially bypassing security controls. You also must use a variety of protocols. So these tunnels can utilize various protocols, including IP, ICMP, TCP, UDP, and also numerous application protocols, making detection and prevention challenging. Specialized tunneling server client applications allow attackers to replace traditional payload content with arbitrary content, enabling data exfiltration or infiltration. There are some encryption complications as well. So this tunneling Tunneling problem gets worse when the tunneling system employs encryption, as it can obscure tunnel traffic from traditional inspection methods. So this complicates the detection and mitigation efforts. Now, tunneling setups using inbound connections may require the hijacking of existing open ports or firewall reconfiguration to open additional ports for the tunnel. And when we talk about tunneling tools and protocols, the attackers can utilize various tunneling tools and protocols to bypass firewall restrictions and establish convert communication channels. Some of these common tools include Loki, Netcad, CryptCat, Tor, HTTP proxy, and others. So these tools enable the attackers to conceal their activities, evade detection, and exfiltrate sensitive data across network boundaries, and it poses a significant security risk. So the best defense against tunneling exploitations is to strictly enforce a deny by default policy for both inbound and outbound communications. So by default, all communications attempts are denied unless they are explicitly permitted by firewall rules. This reduces the attack surface and mitigates the risk of unauthorized tunneling. Now, in the acceptable use policy, you want to clearly define which tunneling tools and protocols are unauthorized and considered security breaches. Then you also want to educate the users about the risk associated with unauthorized tunneling and the consequences of violating the acceptable use policy. So when you do this, when you implement these measures, this helps your organization strengthen your firewall defenses. It also helps to mitigate risk of those tunneling exploits and helps to safeguard your network security. You always want to test your firewall security. This is something that is important to confirm proper configuration, performance, and the strength against attacks and exploits. Failure to test a firewall is a serious breach of best practices and leaves the network unnecessarily vulnerable to security threats. Now, with every update, change, or alteration to any aspect of your firewall or the network segments connecting to it should trigger another round of testing for the firewall. These regular testings help ensure that the firewall remains effective in protecting the network against evolving threats and vulnerabilities. Now, 3 types of tests. One is a simulated firewall test. So you utilize an attack simulator to transmit attack packets to the firewall. This is simulating a real-world attack scenario. This allows administrators to evaluate the firewall's response to various attack vectors and assess its effectiveness in mitigating those threats. A virtual firewall test is where a virtual firewall bastion host is set up and virtual external systems become active. With the virtual firewall test, the administrators can simulate attack scenarios to observe the firewall's behavior and response. Finally, you have a laboratory test. This is conducted in a non-productive subnet. That's done to minimize the impact on live network operations. Now, the laboratory test, what it does, it provides a controlled environment for testing firewall configurations, rule sets, and security policies without risking disruption to critical systems or services. Now, there are some important tools for managing and monitoring a firewall. We'll talk about a few of these. Nmap is a network scanner tool that's used for discovering hosts and services on a computer network. Netstat is a command line tool for displaying network connections, routing tables, and network interface statistics. A few of these: Snort is an open source intrusion detection prevention system that's used for monitoring network traffic. Nexus is a vulnerability scanner tool used for identifying security vulnerabilities in systems and networks. Wireshark is a network protocol analyzer that captures and displays data that is traveling back and forth on the network. Netcat is a utility for reading from and writing to network connections using TCP or UDP. Kali Linux, it's a Linux distribution designed for digital forensics and penetration testing. Finally, syslog is a standard for message logging. This enables centralized logging and monitoring of network devices. So when you're troubleshooting your firewall, one thing you'll do is complete hardware and software inventory that's relative to the firewalls. So you document all the hardware and software components that are relevant to the firewall. This includes models, versions, and configurations. You want to maintain both paper and electronic copies of firewall configuration settings for reference and restoration purposes. You document the firewall policy, outlining rules, permissions, and restrictions for network traffic. Keep a record of any changes made to the firewall configuration. This is including timestamps and descriptions of the alterations. You want to review logs from previous troubleshooting sessions to identify any recurring issues or patterns. You want to monitor activity, error, and alert logs that are generated by the firewall to detect any anomalies and potential security breaches. You also want to document routine maintenance tasks that are performed on the firewall, such as the updates, patches, and system checks. You also want to make sure that you understand the physical and logical network topologies to troubleshoot connectivity issues effectively. Finally, you want to gather information about the current problem. This includes the symptoms, error messages, and affected network resources. That's some other things to keep in mind when you're troubleshooting your firewalls is to have patience. So troubleshooting firewall issues may require time and persistence. You want to make sure that you remain patient and methodical throughout the process. You also want to make sure that you have familiarized yourself with the firewall's features, configurations, and capabilities that allow you to troubleshoot effectively. Also, you want to identify and isolate the specific components or configurations causing the issue to focus on troubleshooting efforts. You also want to simplify complex firewall configurations or rule sets to identify and address potential sources of errors or conflicts. And finally, you want to focus. You want to concentrate troubleshooting efforts on the most critical aspects of the problem to achieve timely resolutions. You also want to refer to change documents to identify any recent modifications to the firewall's configuration that may be related to the issue. Analyze logs from those previous troubleshooting sessions to gain insights to the recurring issues or unsuccessful attempts at resolution. You also want to maintain an updated troubleshooting log to track your current investigations. Also, keep track of the actions you've taken and their outcome for your future reference. Try the quick and easy fixes first. So you want to attempt those simple troubleshooting steps or adjustments that have the potential to resolve the issues quickly before pursuing more complex solutions. You also want to exercise caution when considering solutions that may have a significant impact on firewall operations or configurations. You may want to reserve those as a last resort. You also want to explore free or low-cost troubleshooting options, such as software updates or configuration adjustments, before investing in expensive hardware replacements or upgrades. Also, make your fixes one at a time. So, implementing one solution or adjustment at a time to isolate the impact and accuracy and see how it affects the troubleshooting process. Next, you want to conduct a thorough testing after implementing or a fix or an adjustment to verify its functionality and ensure that it addresses the issue. If a solution exacerbates the problem or it introduces new issues, you want to promptly revert the changes to their previous state to minimize disruptions. If the issue persists after implementing a solution, replicate the failure scenario to gather additional information and redefine your troubleshooting efforts. After resolving an issue, you want to conduct a post-mortem review to analyze the root cause, identify any lessons learned, and implement preventive measures for future issues. Now, when we're detecting firewall threats and responding to incidents, the first step in that is preparation. So you want to select and train members of your security incident response team and allocate necessary resources for incident response activities. You also want to confirm actual breaches by monitoring firewall logs, network traffic, and security alerts for suspicious activities. Then you want to go into the containment area where you restrain further escalation of the incident by isolating affected systems or segments of the network to prevent the spread of the malware or unauthorized access. You want to resolve the compromise by removing malicious components, restoring affected systems from backups, and implementing corrective measures to eliminate the vulnerabilities. When we move into the recovery phase, you want to return to the normal operations by restoring services, verifying system integrity, and monitoring for any residual effects of the incidents. Finally, you want to review the incident response process, analyze your lessons learned, and identify areas for improvement to enhance future incident response capabilities in the follow-up process. So in this chapter, we have talked about firewall management best practices. Where you establish written firewall policies, you conduct regular risk assessments, and maintain a comprehensive inventory of your firewall configurations and settings. We discussed firewall threats and exploit mitigations. So you mitigate firewall threats by staying updated with patches and updates, avoid first-generation firewall products, and implement deny by default policies. We've also discussed the tools for managing and monitoring a firewall. You want to make sure that you utilize tools such as Nmap, Snort, Wireshark for managing, monitoring, and securing firewall configurations and network traffic. Finally, we discussed firewall testing and troubleshooting and how you should test the firewall security regularly, troubleshoot issues methodically, and follow the best practices such as isolation, simplification, and thorough documentation.